Hello, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week I have a conversation about the 1956 Friendly Olympic Games in Melbourne, Australia. My guest is Dr. Harry Blutstein, who's written Cold War Games. It's not just about the Olympics, but it's about the political and global intrigue of the Olympics. In our conversation, we talk about Spies, we talk about defectors, we talk about soccer and blood in the water during water polo matches. We talk about Hungary, the Soviet Union, the United States, the CIA, the KGB, and a little bit of Australia too as well. It's an interesting episode for anyone who's interested in sports, a good story, or the Cold War. You're definitely going to want to check out more of Harry's work at hourofhistory.com, which has links to further reading and all kinds of ways you can get in touch with him. As usual, the Hour of History thanks you for listening. It's great to have you around. It's great to hear your comments and feedback. I love when people reach out to me at hourofhistory.com/contact. Tell me about people they want to hear on their show, because I can keep bringing you great guests just like Harry, whether you're in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, China, Japan, India, South Africa. We've had guests from all over the world, and we certainly do have people listening from all over the world. Together, history is all of ours to enjoy, so I'm going to stop talking so you can enjoy this episode. Thanks again for listening to the Hour of History. On the Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
So, welcome to the Hour of History podcast, Harry. I've been reading your book, Cold War Games. It's just really great to have you on and to talk about the Olympics. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into the history.
Sure. I've been a freelance journalist for over 40 years, and about 10 years ago I decided to go back to my first love, which was history. And my first book was Scent of Globalization, which was published in 2015. I couldn't have thought of a worse time to actually publish a book about the ascent of globalization, because since that book came out, globalization has gone into a steep decline. So that was talking about the wrong book at the wrong time, or perhaps the right book, but at the wrong time. And then I came upon the story of spies and so on at the Olympic Games. And the story was told by the security man for the Olympic Games. And he told stories of spies, of murders, of KGB agents, and so on. And it was the most extraordinary story. Unfortunately, by the time I'd actually got around to starting this particular book, the gentleman concerned had inconveniently died. So I wasn't actually able to get any confirmation. And what he said to the initial outline was not sufficient for a book. And so I dived into the archives. Thankfully, in Australia, our spy agency, which is called ASIO, equivalent to your CIA, not too bad in terms of releasing documents. The trouble is you've actually got to know what you're looking for. And so eventually I started to get some very valuable documents with almost no redaction that told the most extraordinary story of KGB agent operations. The murder that was mentioned possibly did happen, but I couldn't confirm it, where a Hungarian was thrown off a railway bridge.
Now, there's a whole lot there. You're obviously coming to us here from Australia, which is really exciting for the podcast because we have a lot of listeners in Australia, and it's not always easy to connect across the world. So, where's the background to this? You heard this story. Have you always been interested in the connections between Cold War powers or espionage, or were you just looking for a good story?
Just looking for a good story, really. I'd finished the globalization book, and this story just landed on my lap. And as soon as I heard it, I knew it was a great story. I knew I'd have to publish it, at least in Australia. And so I just went for it.
And so you went along this research process led by a question about espionage. Do I have this correct? It wasn't based in a sort of passion for sports or for wanting to understand Australian history or anything like
that. No, it was the sport, although I do describe some of this, but it's more a medium to tell about the Cold War tensions. And one of the areas we don't think about Cold War, it's usually done at a political level, yet sport is a wonderful lens into what's actually happening in the real world, which is not quite the same when we think about the politics of the Cold War. So it gives quite a different perspective, if you like. And one of the things that really interested me, even though a lot of the information I got was from the Australian files, from our own ASIO files, I also had a researcher in Moscow, and she uncovered the most amazing stories, including conversations of Khrushchev about the Olympic Games. Because what a lot of people don't know, and one of the things that came out from this researcher, was that the Soviet Union was actually going to boycott the Olympics, which would have been news. And
can you give us a little more of the setting? When is this? Where is this?
All right.
Yeah.
Good point. We're 1956. We're October. In a month earlier, we've had the Soviets invade Hungary, and as a result, a number of countries boycotted the Olympic Games, although, interestingly enough, the Hungarians came. The Olympic Games here were in November, not October. The Hungarian Revolution was in October. We also had, at the end of October, the invasion of Suez Canal. So it's Great Britain, France, and Israel take over the Suez Canal. So we've got incidents on both sides of the aggression on both sides. So we've got aggression from the communist side, and we've got aggression from, if you like, the Western side of the Cold War. And straight after that, within a few weeks, we've got the Olympic Games. So what actually happened, if I want to go back to Khrushchev, is Khrushchev, the ship bringing the athletes, a number of athletes were coming by ship to Melbourne on a ship called the Gruzia, and a number of others were actually flying in from a training camp, and they were coming through Southeast Asia, Rangoon, and then on to Melbourne. And all of a sudden, from Australia's point of view, they all went out of radio contact around about the 2nd of November. And in terms of, again, a little bit of background on the Hungarian Revolution, it breaks out on, I think, the 22nd or 23rd of October. The Hungarian freedom fighters are pretty successful and drive the Soviets out of Budapest. And a ceasefire is declared on the 2nd of November, but on the 30th of October, and they re-invade, I think, on November the 4th. So I'm not perfect on those dates, but within a day or two, that's about right. And the ship was going to arrive somewhere between those two dates, so the ceasefire and when they were planning to re-invade. And so I immediately assumed that Khrushchev didn't want his team arriving in Melbourne at the same time as he re-invaded Hungary. But it turns out in this conversation that was recorded by his son-in-law, and I got hold of the diary, that he was worried more about Suez, and because Australia was an ally of Great Britain, he was scared that all his athletes would be arrested and imprisoned when they came to Melbourne for the Olympic Games. And that's the sort of paranoia that went on during the Olympic Games. And his Minister of Sport sort of said that's not how the Olympics work, and talked him out of it. And so the ship then steamed into Melbourne. And of course, the Soviet athletes were welcomed with open arms. And in fact, from the highest level of government, the instruction were given to our spy agents of the CIA that they didn't want any incidents to arise or any protests, because they wanted the games to be the friendly game. And that's what they were called.
And this whole picture of an Olympic Games going to happen in Melbourne, which is quite far from many of these nations that are coming to compete. After the Korean War has just concluded, there's these international conflicts brewing. It's really extraordinary any Olympic Games happened. Was there struggle even to get to that point? Why was Australia this place where there could be a friendship games?
Yes, well, I guess although we were allied with the West, we weren't strongly seen on the front line, if you like. But the Olympic Games has an amazing ability to bring people together. So even though the Cold War was going on, and you've got to remember only a few years later in 1961 we get the Berlin Wall being built, both East and West Germany competed in Melbourne in a single team. So the Olympic Games had such prestige that they forced them, and neither East or West wanted to compete in a single team, but they forced them to compete together and under a neutral flag. So the flag was a German tricolour, which was shared by both East and West Germany, with the Olympic rings in white emblazoned over the front of it. So they'd given up part of their sovereignty. The other interesting thing is that Communist China wanted to compete, and they were ready to come to Melbourne. But because of some Cold War machinations with Taiwan, Taiwan manoeuvred them such that they didn't come to them. But they were going to come as well. So, no, the Olympic Games has this sort of miraculous area. One of the German IOC members described it as the island of the blessed. It is seen as a place of non-politics. Now, it's of course rubbish. It's highly political from beginning to end. But it had that reputation and no one wanted to call it out. And it had sufficient prestige that it could bring East and West Germany together. It almost brought together the two Koreas a few years after the Korean War.
And so these teams are taking journeys that are much more magnificent than now. You know, now you could, well, not at this moment, but theoretically you could hop in a jet and be in Melbourne almost directly from anywhere, from most places in the world. I mean, back then, as you described, they're connecting through Rangoon and going on ships. These are pretty tense moments in the lead up to this opening ceremony.
Well, it certainly was for the Hungarian. For everyone else, it was just a long journey. If they were coming on the ship, they trained on the decks. The flights were certainly tiresome. But for most of the athletes, it was something that they were looking forward to. The Hungarians were in a dreadful situation. So a lot of them had actually been involved in the Hungarian Revolution. The captain of the water polo team had actually gone around to police station and ensured that guns were released to the freedom fighters. So he was involved very, very intimately. At the time, while they were still in Budapest, as the revolution was going on, they were all holed up in the Red Star Hotel, which was just outside Budapest. So they could hear the shooting. And supposedly they were in lockdown. But a number of them snuck out at night. One guy who used to work in the industrial area went to the factory and liberated some chemicals that could be used for Molotov cocktails. The shooters went out and got live practice on Russian.
Oh, gee.
And so they were intimately involved. Now, they leave on around about the 29th of October, after the revolution looks like it's won. All the Russians are withdrawn. They can't fly out because the airport has been destroyed. They take a bus. And even that is dangerous because one of the things you've got to know is that the athletes were very privileged, and they often worked in the army or in the police force, not because they were soldiers or policemen, but they were basically professionals, and that's how the government subsidised. So they were well off, they had earned a lot of money, and they dressed really well. So they tended to wear clothes like leather jackets, patent leather shoes, nice trousers, and the rest of it. The trouble is that the clothes that the secret police wore, the AVO, which they were called the equivalent of the KGB, also wore leather jackets, good patent shoes, and so on. So a number of athletes, as they were going to the bus, to catch the bus to go to Czechoslovakia and then fly out to Melbourne, were stopped. And so one particular athlete, a fencer, who I spoke to, Eugene Hummery, and he gets stopped by freedom fighters as he's going. And they open up his suitcase and they find his ID, which says he's a policeman. Well, they're ready to shoot him. And so he says, look, there's a long white bag on my back. Look in that. And they looked in that, and it had his sabre. And he said, the secret police do not carry sabres. Olympic fencers do. I'm an Olympic fencer. And of course, they let him go. And so, it's a funny story, but it could have ended really badly.
Yeah.
And that was the environment they had when they left. Now, they weren't sure whether to leave or not because their families were behind and so on. But it looked like the Russians had given up. They were going to allow freedom in Hungary. And so they went to Czechoslovakia. And then they flew out of Czechoslovakia, and between Czechoslovakia and Melbourne, which took about a week because it was a charter flight, the same pilots were there, so the pilots had to stop every night to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So it took five days or longer. And they were struggling to get news. All the newspapers they saw were in foreign languages that they couldn't read, and so on. And so they were very, very distressed. And so, for example, the wife of the water polo captain, who I mentioned earlier, her name is Eva Sekasi, when they're in Pakistan, she's left behind her 2-year-old daughter and her mother-in-law, who is blind. And she goes to the airport and goes up to an American fighter pilot and says, take me back to Budapest.
Oh,
and he says, I don't know if I can quite do that. He says, well, take me to Europe. And he says, no, we're not a passenger service. And she's literally crying and begging him on the tarmac.
Yeah.
And so can you imagine what state they arrived in when they got to Melbourne and they discovered that the Russians had reinvaded? And there were rumours that Budapest was just a smoking hole in the ground.
Yeah.
And so they were in dreadful state. A lot of them dropped weight. They couldn't eat. They were very angry with the Soviets. And that's really for what became the most famous encounter, which is the water polo semi-final between the Soviet Union and Hungary.
Yeah, and as we get into that, I mean, it's an important thing that we should stop and consider just the extraordinary circumstances under which this takes place. You have two nations that are clearly at war fighting that are going to also be playing sports, which are kind of a substitute for this, but not really. You can express your nationalism without killing each other, but this is also you really write this tension into your book, and then we get to, like you mentioned, this war in the water.
That's right. It's someone described it as sport is like war but firing with blanks. So it's a proxy war. From the Hungarians' point of view, they had to win. They'd been humiliated in Hungary, and it would be a further humiliation to then be beaten by the Russians. They played the Russians a lot of time, but like a lot of athletes, and they were actually reasonably friendly with one another, although there were tensions, but they were generally friendly. And in fact, and this becomes quite relevant to the game, the captain of the Russian team, a Georgian, and I'll just use his nickname because I have trouble pronouncing long Russian Georgian names.
As many do.
Is Mishi. And Mishi, when he ever competed in Budapest, would actually stay with the Hungarian captain and play with his daughter. So that's fairly friendly. When they got into the pool and the fighting started, one of the incidents was Jarmati, the Hungarian captain, went up to Mishi and belted him in the face and broke his nose. And as Mishi is wiping the blood out of his face, Jarmati hits him again in the face. Now, this is a guy who's played with his daughter perhaps 12 months earlier, who was a family friend. And that all ended after the invasion. These guys were angry, really, really angry. But the problem is, when they were preparing for this game, was they were out of form. They hadn't trained for a month, which for Olympic athletes is really, really bad news. And even in Melbourne, they only had a certain amount of time to train in the pool. And the best they could do was go down to the beach and train there, which wasn't exactly ideal. And so they arrived underprepared, which meant that they had every chance of losing. And one of their members, Kalaman, he was their tactician. And he came up the night before with a new tactic. And if you're into basketball, you've heard of zone defense.
Mm-hmm.
He used zone defense. And that had never been played in water polo in 1950. And as a result, the Russians were totally bamboozled. And as a result, the game went 4-0 with the Hungarians winning. And they won most of the fights too.
And they had the famous sort of press images that showed the struggle and kind of portrayed them as a struggling people, huh?
That's right. So the real story is not quite as what you see in the newspaper. The photo, for those of you who haven't seen it, just Google blood in the water and water polo and it'll come up. And it's a Hungarian guy called Ivan Zador with blood flowing down his face. And what had been happening was that he and the guy he was on had been belting one another. So but the Russian had certainly not started it. They were both tough cookies. And so they've been belting one another. The referee, the Swede, was very much on the side of the Hungarian. So if he saw a fight, he'd always give the free against the Russian. And so they'd been belting one another. Zador heard the whistle, assumed that the referee had seen them hitting one another. It's only a minute or so to go before the end of the game. He turns around to see whether he's got a free, just as the Russian is raising up in the air to hit him again and strikes him in the eye. And the only thing that was accidental was striking him in the eye. But you know the eye bleeds. Normally they would prefer to hit one another in the jaw or on the chest, which is what they'd been doing up till then. And so he starts to bleed. And so he's ready to get out of the pool. He's right next to the exit. And Jarmity, the captain, swims over to him and sees this blood flowing down his face. And thinking on his feet, he says, "No, you're not getting out. I want to see you swim across the pool, and I want you to leave blood in the pool. And when you get out, make sure your face is always facing towards the cameras."
Oh, wow.
And that's what he did. So the incident wasn't staged, but the photo was.
Yeah. And the Hungarian athletes and the Soviet athletes to an extent, and you talk about this in your book, are heavily involved in politics in one way or another, whether it's them making a personal decision on if they should defect after the games and not go back to Hungary, or if they're making decisions to work with other governments at the games. You have some great stories in your book. Would you like to share one of those? What else were these athletes doing?
Sure. Well, in terms of the Cold War, defections were really important to America. You know, here are the athletes, they're the elite within their countries, and yet, you know, they've seen what the West is like and they will, you know, they've defected to the West. So they're real prizes in a Cold War context. But as I mentioned before, the Australian government didn't want any defections and in fact had specifically indicated it wouldn't accept any defections before the end of the games because they were worried the Soviets would walk out. They wanted them to be the friendly game. The Americans had a different view, but the CIA had been banned from Melbourne. So what had happened was a gentleman called C.D. Jackson, who was at the time the publisher of Time Life magazine. But before that, he had worked as an advisor. He was the Cold War advisor to Eisenhower. He was his speechwriter. And after he left the White House, he was more or less the go-to man on any Cold War dirty tricks. And he would open doors between the State Department, CIA, and White House. And he could go any place he wanted and they would work with him. So even though he was a private citizen at this point. And so he sets up a private operation called Operation Griffin to get athletes to defect, Hungarians, although in the end a few Romanians also. And of course, these would be all considered Cold War victories. And then after the game, they would tour the US. And again, this also had, everything has to have the name of an operation. That was called Operation Eagle. And that would be a propaganda tour of the US. So that is put in place. And he uses journalists from Sports Illustrated, a journal that I understand is still in print, to actually get the athletes to defect. The problem is, or was, that of course they didn't speak Hungarian and most of the Hungarian athletes didn't speak English. And so they rope in this a guy called George Telegi, who's a very shadowy character. called himself a count, although that's doubtful that he was, and he acts as the translator. But he's got a real political agenda. He's far right wing, and in the end, they pull in another guy called Brody, Alexander Brody, who's an American Hungarian who happens to be at the game, and they use him to translate for them. And the fun thing here is, being the Cold War, of course, you've got to use code. So the telegrams between New York and Melbourne are all in code. Now, this is not exactly a sophisticated code. So it's all predicated on the fact that there's going to be an exhibition match of Australian rules football, which is different than your sort of football. It's unique to our country. And it's going to be a tour of the US between a team from Victoria and New South Wales. And so what they did is they gave every Hungarian male the name of an Australian rules footballer, fictitious, from Victoria, and the women were given male names of fictitious footballers from New South Wales. And so they would communicate that. One of the telegrams sort of says, look, we wanted to speak, to recruit particular footballers, but the trouble is the fans are getting in the way. The fans was code for the KGB. And so it went. And normally, because it was a private operation, these documents weren't with the CIA, and they actually got deposited in the Eisenhower Library. So I actually got all the telegrams plus the code.
Oh, wow. And so the code was already what had been cracked or explained in the library?
Yes. What had happened was afterwards, Sports Illustrated wrote a report on the whole operation, including all the telegrams, what actually went on, and the code and the breakdown of the code. So it was absolutely wonderful source of material if you're a historian to get that sort of material.
You wonder if these people, I mean, obviously this is an important moment in their life and defecting and thinking about this. I wonder if they ever knew of their code name or their fake name or their...
Oh, no, they wouldn't have known anything about that. So they did go ahead and did the tour of the US. Quite a few stayed, but the Hungarian government, by now it's a puppet government. So the reformers have been removed by the Soviets and it's a puppet government, but they're going gentle because the athletes are more popular than politicians in Hungary. And they couldn't afford to punish them or to be too obvious in punishing. And so they allowed an amnesty that the athletes could come back to Hungary with no repercussion as long as they came back in March the following year. Now, they knew the tour was only going to go till February. So they took into account that, and it opened the door for the Hungarians. Now, the Hungarians, quite a few, were all going to go home. I mean, Hungarians get very homesick. And so for a number of them, they defected but didn't really defect. They went on the tour with every intention of always going back to Budapest. And it was really interesting to read the books that they produced as they travelled around America on what they saw, because you got a totally different perspective from an Iron Curtain person on what the West was like. And may I say, they weren't, certainly the consumer society and all the rest was much more than what they saw at home. But they also saw a lot of faults. And, they weren't Cold War warriors. They were just seeing it as they saw it. But they were treated as celebrities. They got on the Ed Sullivan Show. But they also saw that they were celebrities in that they were Cold War defectors, unlike in Hungary, where they were celebrities because they were athletes. So, just imagine the most, I don't know enough about American football, but Magic Johnson is a name I've heard of. Someone of that level of fame, but most probably 10 times more famous. These athletes, if they had a dispute on a parking, would write to the Prime Minister, who would deal with it personally. That was the level of prestige.
And it's hard to comprehend that, especially if we take into account the time period. But this was definitely a feature of the way sports were seen and understood and just basically operated in behind the Iron Curtain. And you write about it as this lack of religious opiate is replaced by sports in some way. Can you talk a little bit about the power of sport behind the Iron Curtain?
All right. In the Soviet Union, all the football teams, and they were crazy about football, as you say, it was the opiate of the people, were based on institutions. So the Navy had its own team. The Air Force had its own team. The secret police had its own, called Diamo, and I'll come back to Diamo in a minute. And the food processors had a team called Spartacat, based on the name of Spartacus as a Roman freedom fighter. And so if you went along to a game of, say, Diamo, secret police, against Spartacat, which was treated as the People's Party, the way you would protest, and the KGB couldn't do anything, was to boo the KGB team of Diamo. And they did. Mm-hmm. And it got so bad that the KGB actually put their own agents around the stadium, and they were looking outwards and so on. So you had this sort of thing going on. And there's a rather long story I tell in the book. It was also a matter of prestige for the leaders in the KGB. So the KGB leaders, the head of the KGB, the head of the Air Force, and so on, this also was used in their struggles for the Kremlin. So you could actually see who was winning in the Kremlin on who was winning on the football field. So if, the Air Force team was winning, it meant the Air Force general in the Kremlin was doing better than the KGB in terms of the pecking order. Mm-hmm. There were 3 football matches that I talk about. In 1945, there's a friendlies in the UK.
Yes.
And at that point, it's a Diamo team that goes because it's the KGB that is on top.
And yeah, if I could step in too, because that's such a fascinating piece there, where the Soviets go to the United Kingdom after they have this good relationship after World War II, and there's this kind of British misconception that the Soviets are going to be like poorly trained amateur athletes.
That's right.
But that wasn't the system at all. Yeah. Could you explain, like, who are these athletes? They're not just, the officer down the street.
No. I mean, even during the war, the one thing they kept going was football. And so if you didn't want to get drafted and you were a good footballer, that's exactly what you did. They played more of a team game. They were very fast. And their tactics were totally different. So after, I think, 5 friendlies, they drew 1, and the rest were 2-2 or something like that. So at the end of it, it was all even, but they gained enormous respect from that. And then in 1952, at the Olympic Games, the first Olympic Games the Soviets go to, they play football and they lose to Yugoslavia. And again, Cold War politics comes in here, because Yugoslavia had broken away from Stalin. And in fact, both Stalin and Tito, the president of Yugoslavia, had organised to assassinate one another. There have been assassination attempts on, both of them are reciprocated, the compliment, if you like. As you know, neither were successful, but they did try hard. And so Stalin, who wasn't interested in football at all, pays attention to this game. And when his side loses, can you imagine how those athletes feel? And so the coach is recalled immediately, and he's thinking, it looks like it's Siberia. Right. He's sacked, but it isn't Siberia. And then the team comes. And at this point of history, it was actually a half KGB team and a half army team. But at the debriefing with Stalin, the coach is asked, is it a KGB team or is it an army team? Well, seeing the head of KGB at the meeting, Bera, he says, oh no, it was an army team. And so the army team goes back to the National League. So again, I don't know enough about American football. The Dodgers, are they a well-known team?
Baseball, yeah.
Give me a football. Lakers.
No basketball. You
I'm
you
not
got
doing
all
well,
of
am
us.
I?
Yeah, well, let's say the New England Patriots.
All right, the Patriots. So imagine it's the Patriots who have been the main basis of playing in the Olympics. They've lost. They've come back. They've gone back to the normal, games that you're playing for the finals. Okay. They play 3 games. They win them all. And then one day they're heading off for the 4th game of the season, and the head of the Minister for Sport arrives as they're getting onto the bus, and he says, "You no longer exist as a team."
Oh, gee.
And no one is told. They've just disappeared. So can you imagine if the Patriots just one day just disappeared? There was nothing in the newspaper.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
And that's it. And that's what happened after they lost in 52. And in 56, it's the Spartaket. Stalin is dead. The secret police Bera is dead. The KGB are in decline. And it's the Spartak king that comes to Melbourne, almost loses, but does win. Sorry, I've given it away. I should have said spoiler alert.
Yeah, no, and there's really great stories in that. I think one of the cool things about 56 is it's at this turning point in the sport before it just becomes so. I mean, the rules have been passed, but for example, you have India and Indonesia competing with very different styles and tactics, and you have a lot of teams that you don't necessarily see in the modern game. So it's fun to read, but the expectations are always there for the Soviet players. They're the heroes, right?
Yeah, look, as you say, these were the heroes. They were treated as heroes as long as they won. And they could stand up to the KGB even. There's one story I tell in my book. There was a famous victory in the long distance in the 5,000 and the 10,000 by Vladimir Kutz. And it was a classic race against the English. He runs the 10,000. He beats them. They say, well, running the 5,000, it's another gold medal. And he says, no, he's very unwell. He's pissing blood. And they said, we'll give you a general's pension if you run. And he says, all right, I'll run.
Jeez.
And he runs again and he wins. He is in a very privileged position, and he expects after the games to fly back to Moscow. His wife's there. He's very much in love with his wife. He misses her terribly, but they force him back on the ship, which means it's a 3-week journey. And so he goes on a bender. He was a drunk anyway, but he goes on a serious bender. So he's the most famous athlete, acting, in a very un-Soviet way. So the KGB guy pulls him aside and he says, all right, tomorrow morning, sober up, and I want you to do self-criticism in front of the whole team. So the whole team gathers the next day. Kutz turns up, and it doesn't look good because there's 2 people holding him up.
Oh, no.
He cannot stand by himself. And the KGB guy sort of says, well, what have you got to say? And Kutz says, well, the only thing I've got to say to you is fuck you. I'm not going to do anything, Yeah. You just get me back to Moscow. And he got away with it.
They knew their power.
Different dynamic. It's a different dynamic. If you're a winner, like Kutz was, they couldn't touch you. If you lost the football, like they did in 52, you came very close to going to Siberia. If you were a football team, like the equivalent of the Patriots, you disappeared off the face of the world.
And I don't know. It's kind of endlessly fascinating where you can go with this, and you certainly found a lot of these stories. I'm thinking too of Nina who disappears. There are people who do disappear and show up in places later and end up being all right in the Soviet Union after, whether it's because of their athletic ability or not. But from all of these stories, is there any sort of conclusion that you can draw about being an athlete behind the Iron Curtain? Or
I certainly can. Look, the politicians knew that the athletes were more popular than they were. So what they wanted to do is use the athletes to, if you like, make them a tool of the state. These athletes who we're looking after, which is why they got looked after so well, these athletes will reciprocate because the state has looked after them and given them all these privileges by, supporting the state. And generally that did happen.
And ultimately, though, that's where we get into this interesting concept of protest, where we see it too in the systems that we have today in the West, where that's kind of the unwritten rule, I guess you could say, with athletes. We're going to give you this money, this prestige, this power, especially in college football in the United States. There's no money. It's the promise of money if you behave. And so then there's this tension of, should I push back against this system I don't agree with, or just go with it?
Right. Well, you're exactly right. And of course, I think the dynamics has changed. At the moment, I'm writing a book on the 1968 Olympics, and that's the famous salute by Smith and Carlos.
Yeah, could you give us a little foreshadowing, a little hint, what interests you about that?
Well, I guess, again, a lot of what you read today, I mean, they've become, part of the mythology of it. I mean, if you look up Black Power, in 1968, Black Power was really the Panthers. If there was Google in 1968, if you Googled Black Power, you would have got a photo of, one of the Panthers in their berets and sunglasses. If you Google Black Power today, you'll find Smith and Carlos. We've actually forgotten where the word originally came from and who the connotations it has. And they're seen as political figures. I've gone back to the period and tried to look at it from their point of view. And these guys were athletes. I've spoken to a lot of the athletes from that time, and they're a bit hazy in their memory of the salute. But if you ask them what they ran in a particular race, they'll give it to you to the 100th of a second. Okay? Because they were athletes. Politics was secondary. By that, it wasn't that they thought it was unimportant. It was very important. But they were athletes. And particularly if you were African American, your one way out of the ghetto was sport. These days, of course, they're earning hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
And to be quite honest, if they protest and they have to give up their sport, they've still got at least a couple of $100 million in the bank. So it's no great sacrifice. But for Smith and Carlos, all they were doing was getting money for wearing shoes, Puma, and not peanuts really compared to what you get today. And they were hoping that off the fame of a gold medal, or in case of Carlos, a bronze, that they would get pro football and start to earn some real money. Because, they were really struggling. They'd been sleeping on floors. Tommy Smith had been working in a car wash. So these guys were dirt poor. This was their way out. And they knew beforehand that if they protested, there would be consequences. Now, Smith and Carlos didn't know what those... everyone who protested after, the one I'm writing about at the moment is Lee Evans, who ran in the 400. And because it was after Smith and Carlos and what had happened to them, he exactly knew the consequences. So his position psychologically was much more difficult, whereas at least Smith and Carlos, it was a spare of the moment decision to raise their fists. As far as I can find out, they hadn't decided it before. Tommy Smith on the stand just sort of said, all right, I've got the glove on, I'm going to stick. And he did. It was a split second without thinking. And I think it would have been the only way he would have done it. If you'd thought about the consequences and so on, well, no.
And going forward to today, we've seen the Tokyo Olympics as being postponed. What do you see as some of the political currents for this Olympic Games?
Yes, there's a couple of flashpoints, if you like. Yeah. Putting aside virus issues, it's in Japan. There is a big issue between Korea and Japan over comfort women during the Second World War, where in Japan they call them comfort women. Basically, it was forced prostitution. And I would imagine that, that would be a good reason to protest. And there's frictions all around the world. The Olympic Games are unique, and this comes back to my earlier interest in globalisation. For 16 days, the stadium, the village, the swimming pools become international space. They no longer belong to that country. They're under a different flag, the Olympic flag. So can you imagine any other country that would allow a foreign flag to fly above their own? Yet that's what happens in the Olympic Games. The Olympic rule supreme during those games. I don't know what happens today, but back in 56, you could come into Australia, not on a passport that was issued by the US, but by a identity document issued by the Olympic Committee.
Wow.
So you actually gave up your sovereignty in so many ways. And so that is a unique space, as was described, the Isle of the Blessed. And again, this is where the Olympic Games is different. It's not just another sporting event. It started off as a humanitarian program to encourage better understanding between people and world peace. And it still has that today, although I would argue it's been overtaken by commercial interest. But that was exactly what had happened. And the problem with Smith and Carlos is that they had been specific. The Olympic Games was quite happy to talk about human dignity, which you could say is the equivalent of human rights, and certainly that was denied to African Americans in the 60s, probably still is. But they were specific. They were pointing the finger at what was happening in the US, and that was what. So the Olympic movement was happy to talk about generalities as long as they were platitudes.
Yeah.
And the same today. So they still talk about world peace, although I think it's even less so now than it was in 56 and 68, because the commercial thing has just taken over. They cannot afford to have dissent. And an example of that was in 2006. Coca-Cola sponsored the relay because it was wonderful as a promotional opportunity, because Coca-Cola logo was seen right around the world, because the relay was one of the longest ever in Olympic history. It went through lots of different countries, through Europe and, the Americas and so on. And Coca-Cola went along with it, with its logo. But of course, all the Tibetan people protested.
Right.
And so it turned out to be a PR disaster for Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
And of course, it devalues the Olympic brand of the rings.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see going forward what happens absolutely with Tokyo, and as always, interesting to look into the past and figure out, once we get these classified documents. Now, how would listeners around the world access your work? We'll have links to things on the Hour of History website, hourofhistory.com. But where are you now with your books being published in Australia and the United States?
Sure. Well, the next book, which I'm still not quite sure of the title, it'll either be called Games of Discontent or Discontent in the Isle of the Blessed. Not quite sure which one. Which one do you think sounds better?
I like Games of Discontent, but
okay. No, I'll add that to the list of votes. That will be available in North America, hopefully just before the Olympic Games. So this particular book, it's got an Australian publisher, which means it's not available even on Amazon outside Australia. At the moment, I'm looking around for an American publisher, so hopefully someone will come forward soon, because I think it's a book that will very much appeal to American audience and other audiences overseas, because it's, funnily enough, it's not a book about Australia.
No,
it's a book about the Cold War.
It
and
isn't.
Most of the characters are American or German or English or so
Hungarian,
on.
Russian. Yeah, I would suggest it to people with interest in Eastern Europe and Cold War. Absolutely, the United States.
Exactly right. And so hopefully a publisher will come forward and it will be available there. But at the moment, it is not available, sadly.
Yeah, and it is it'll be interesting to see your next book, and we'll certainly have to talk then. Unfortunately, for now we're out of time, but fortunately we're here at the bit of suggestion. You can have your banana avocado moment here, or you can suggest whatever you like, Harry. What do you think the listeners of the Hour of History podcast should do?
All right. Well, I spend all day reading non-fiction. So at night, when I want to relax, my reading tastes are rather basic. And if you want a really wonderful bit of escapism in the year of the plague, we need things to cheer ourselves up. An American author by the name of Carl Hiaasen is one of my guilty pleasures. So anything by Carl Hiaasen, he's got an insane, it's very, very satirical. If I want to cheer myself up, I pull out one of his books. So that's my recommendation.
That's a great suggestion. And it is important to have these books that cheer us up. I'm suggesting that you find a way to get access to those books. My suggestion is that you reach out to your local library right now, because a lot of them have online lending platforms. So even if you can't, because of virus reasons, go to your personal library, I have a few friends who have actually reached out to the library, and then they've set up accounts remotely and been able to borrow perhaps a Carl Hiaasen book.
We've already got that here. It's very well set up in Australia in terms of doing everything from home. And certainly we can borrow from libraries and so on. May I say that it hasn't changed my lifestyle at all. Being a writer, I've been self-isolated for the last 3 years. So it's not changed my lifestyle one iota.
The writers and the graduate students were prepared for this in a way that not everyone was. But well, thanks so much for joining us on the Hour of History, Harry. Is there anything else to add?
No, it's been a pleasure talking to Stephen, and best of luck with the podcast. I really enjoy it, and the ones that I've listened to. It's a great project that you've undertaken there.
Thank you so much. On the Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.